Hello everyone, and welcome once again to a video for New Introduction to the New Testament. I wanted to share some things with you. I know that probably none of you are itching to read another book about the New Testament, but I am reviewing a book for an academic journal, and it's this one here. I know there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's Reading the New Testament, an introduction. It's a third edition. It's by a lady named Theme Perkins. She's a graduate of Harvard, got her PhD a long time ago. She wrote the first edition in like the late 70s, and then 10 years later or so, she did the second edition, and now we have the third. But it's a beautiful read. It's updated, so even though it was written 30 years ago, the language is it's like the NIV. You know, like Metzger is probably King James version. Introduction to the New Testament. I chose Metzger because he covers everything that an undergraduate student needs to know. To be introduced to the New Testament, and he does so reliably. And it's hard to come by a book that good. But Feem does a very good job of introducing the New Testament. And, a lot has happened in the past 30 years in New Testament scholarship. New Testament scholars have a, a very frequent tendency to change their minds. And that makes my life miserable sometimes because everybody's changing their mind all the time. So I just wanted to just let you know about this book because if you want to buy a book for your library or you just want to read a good smooth introduction to the New Testament, this is it. I do think Metzger is good and smooth too, but this is just another option. And there's another book I wanted to show you. My mouse is really sensitive. Okay. Palestine in the Time of Jesus. I hated this book the first time I read it, but it's by Casey Hansen. I think that on the syllabus I have his website. His website is amazing. He just has so much cool stuff about the New Testament. Like you can look at the earliest New Testament manuscripts, for example. That's where I got a lot of my pictures, and I can tell by looking at the cover here that it's been updated recently. So I read one, when I read it, it was a very recent edition. So you can see second edition. Come on. Yeah, second edition. So if you read this one, you'll get to read something that I didn't. And mine came with a CD of, a treasure trove of stuff about the New Testament. I didn't like this because it seemed like it was concentrating so much on the social structures and social conflicts that it really didn't focus on what students need to know about the New Testament. So I read this book with a mean-spirited attitude, but I ended up liking it after 4 or 5 years of hating it. So New Testament scholars change their mind. I wanted to take the opportunity now to respond to a few really insightful questions that have come up in the reading reviews, and I was thinking to tell you that if I think these questions are important, they're probably going to be on the midterm. So let's take a look at these. First question, and I didn't look, I never look at names whenever I'm reviewing things. It's always a blind grading, so I don't know who came up with these questions, but they're awesome. And they're from different people. Okay, first question. If the Synoptic Gospels are so parallel literally, why not form them into one? It's an outstanding question. And the answer is they were originally one in the sense of one mass. What happened was you have Jesus and his disciples in Jerusalem and Galilee, and then that's the original message of Jesus, and those people and the Christians that added to that original number, they spread the gospel out into the world. So you have a singular source. The gospel is a singular event that happened at a specific point in time. About over a 3-year period in Galilee and Jerusalem, and then the earliest Christians, spread that message around, and it got changed due to geography, because in different areas where the churches were formed, they had different problems, and they developed their uh, Christian message, their gospel, to meet their needs. So the answer is yes, they were once one, and that's why they're so parallel now. And we call this process Q. Q is from quelle, which means source, and we'll look at, since we're online, go to the almighty wiki. I'm a big fan of Wikipedia because it's fast and it's sometimes faster than me. Q source, known as a Q document. Now, I don't think that Q is a document. Q was a spoken kerygma. It's the core of the gospel. And as that source was spoken and eventually became written down, it went through a process of change. So I want to show you something about Wikipedia if you don't know already. For one thing, it's improved over the years. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here. And this is how I use Wikipedia most of the time. I just scroll down to the bottom and you have scholarly sources. And you can use these sources to your benefit. So that's what I do. And I would not recommend copying and pasting from Wikipedia into anything. I'm a freelance editor on for my real job, and I once edited a book where at least 40% of it was copied directly from Wikipedia, and I've seen graduate papers too. But it's good to get a basic knowledge. Like if you don't understand a word, look it up on Wikipedia. Read the article, maybe go and read some of the sources, and you can talk intelligently about these things. So I want to encourage you to read this article. It's very, very, very good. So I had a long talk with a guy, Kloppenberg, who wrote many books on Q, and he said he's sick of it and didn't want to talk about it anymore. But this reason right here, you can see this two-source hypothesis. Matthew using Q and Luke using Q and Mark being used by both of them. This is a singular reason why I decided to study Paul, because Paul doesn't have this mess. Okay, now this was part of that. Matthew ends up being to Jewish readers, Mark to Gentiles, and Luke to Christians. You can see in that the geographical changes. Like Matthew was probably in a Jewish community, writing it for Jews, and Mark in a Gentile community, writing it to Gentiles, and Luke probably wrote a little bit later, whenever there was a group of Christians. So, we have the gospel originally being one, and when I say one, I don't mean a singular. It's like one mass. The Christians were saying different things, and they went out, but it was pretty much the same. I know that's really confusing, but we think that Q was modified at least 4 or 5, 6 times, even before it was written. So it's a very complex problem, but I'm trying to just hit on the simplest thing, the mountaintop. Okay, if the Bible is in fact a history book, or a book of history, which is how I read it, then isn't it isn't excluding historical literature like cutting out a piece of history? And the example that this student gives is the apocryphal and the pseudepigraphal literature. Okay, I disagree with the premise behind the question, but I respect it very much because, I'm highlighting it as a good question. Um, the thing is, even though these writings were excluded from the canon, we still have access to them, and they still tell us, the pseudepigrapha, for example, it still reveals the development of Jewish life. So just because it was excluded from the canon doesn't mean it was lost to history. It's just taken a different path. So I don't think that's exactly accurate. And the New Testament canon was developed out of use. So you have all of these writings falling by the wayside, and the New Testament documents are the ones that were most used over a wide geographical area and a long period of time. So some writings were lost, and I lament that as a historian, but they were lost due to neglect. They weren't being used, and well, that's the primary part. They weren't being used or being read. They weren't being used in worship. So the other thing is, the only reason why we know about some of the lost works is because they're mentioned by Christian writers. Some of the documents that we only knew, like we knew of the Gospel of Thomas before it was discovered, because it was mentioned by the Christian named Origen in his writings. So, it's not really lost just because it's not in the Bible. Okay, I really like this question. I thought about it a lot, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's such a good question we should think about it. And it's here in all caps. How would history have changed if each of Herod the Great's sons received a different portion of the lands? So that's a really good question, and I read through it. So read through the student's explanation of the question several times, and I disagree with this, or I don't know how to agree with this last part. That the conclusion is that actually we need both of these sentences here. The conclusion is that the Roman Empire was exercising its power by assigning the sons of Herod the Great their various areas to rule. And what if they were switched around, or the Roman Empire decided to exercise more power? Now, I don't think that Jesus is a significant enough character for the Roman Empire to intervene and execute him. Yes, he was executed by a Roman, Pilate, a Roman delegate, if you will, puppet king, or governor. He was executed by the Romans, but he was executed at the behest of the Jews. So you have this event where Jesus is only significant because he made some Jews angry, and this whole episode of Jesus being tried and put to death, it has a very specific context, where he goes before Herod, he's found innocent. He goes before Pilate, he's found innocent. And then you have this whole fiasco with letting Barabbas go, and then Jesus is crucified. If we remove that from the equation, Jesus is he's historically insignificant during his own time. He becomes significant because he gains a worldwide mass of followers. But in that time, I don't think that the Roman Empire would have done anything about Jesus at all. But that's an opinion. Okay, this is not an opinion here. The Bible was translated into so many languages. Could there be any way the interpretation be misconstrued? Now, I'm not sure exactly if I understand the question, but yes, there is a way that interpretation is misconstrued, and it can be misconstrued on so many different levels that it makes my head hurt when I try to think about it. Because you have to think about all the layers of history and all the things that were going on, all the contradictions and paradoxes of the ancient times, and then you have to travel with that knowledge 2,000 years into the future, which is our present, understand all of the philosophical things that have influenced us and have influenced previous interpreters. And then you have to know the language, and you have to know technique of how to interpret. And I mean, it's just a pain. But the translation of the Bible, if you know a law of thermodynamics is loss, anytime something happens to it, you're going to lose something. But that's why we translate the Bible in committees. The NIV committee is just massive. And I actually know somebody that was on the NIV translation team, or the original team. And I know another guy that's on the NIV translation team for an upcoming revision. And they are amazing at Greek. I mean, amazing. But transforming the Greek into English or whatever, it's an interpretation itself. Whenever I translate Greek, I know the grammar and syntax, how the words fit together in Greek, and they fit together in Greek radically different from how they fit together in English. So it's going to lose something, and hopefully it gains something too. But I have to, after I translate it, I have to debate with other scholars about did I define this word right? Did I uh, get the word order correct? Did I identify the subject of the sentence correctly? And every other layer of criticism that we have to go through. Um, so yes, we lose a lot. And how do you quantify that? Well, you can have a more literal translation of the Bible, like the English Standard Version, or you can have a less literal standard of translation and have something like the NIV. And if you notice, the NIV reads very, very smoothly. And to achieve that smoothness, you have to have a high level of interpretation, which means that you look at the Greek and you try to translate it as literally as possible. And in order to make it modern English, take that literal raw translation and make it modern English, you're going to have to make a whole lot of decisions about what that sentence means to convey the same kind of ideas into something the English reader can understand who likes that kind of NIV talk. And it's very unfortunate that the NIV is sold to evangelicals as a literal translation whenever it's not. It's a beautiful translation, but it's not literal. Okay, the author of our text, that's Metzger, believes that the Pharisees were the successors of the Hasidians. The question assumes it's true, and the student is not convinced personally that it is. And I love that there's disagreement. And this is a part I found interesting in the question. Once a Maccabean revolt was successful, was there a need for pious groups to continue? And the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason for that is the Maccabean revolt did not end Roman rule. The Maccabean revolt was long gone by the time Jesus got on the scene, and the Romans were in control and making life miserable for the Jews. So, yes, they absolutely needed the Pharisees um, after the Maccabean revolt. I had to look up this question. I didn't know it. What did Jesus mean by the comment, "Go and tell that fox"? Uh, that shows he heard Herod was trying to get rid of him. This comes from the Gospel of Luke. And, you know, the Pharisees tell Jesus to get out of town because Herod wants to kill him. And then Jesus says, "Go and tell that fox this and such." So the question is, what does that mean? And I like this insight here. I have to admit, I never really thought about this verse that much. I just read it as an insult. What it means, I really didn't care that much. But I really like this insight here. I believe that once Jesus heard that Herod was trying to stop Jesus and his preaching ways, Jesus made it seem like it would be a game of catch me if you can. Like he's kind of teasing Herod, and he's like, "You're the fox and I'm a mouse, and try and catch me." That's pretty insightful. It made me think. And then the question, I guess, with the comment. Oh, this is more on why they asked the question. With the comment about the fox, he made it seem that Herod is out for blood, and will try to track him down. Now, that's really interesting. I looked it up, and in the book Uneasy Neighbors, Church and State in the New Testament by Walter E. Pilgrim. It's available in Google Books, at least in preview. Page 87. He said that and he actually gives sources in both the Jewish context and the Greco-Roman context. The fox is an insult, and it means always critical or crafty, like a fox. This kind of craftiness has been passed down into even our language today. We have the same idiom, and you'd be surprised. I found some pretty surprising idioms in Greek that we still say in English, and some of them are. I can only think of the inappropriate ones at the moment. But he also introduced, and I'm not convinced of this yet, but I'm going to definitely study it. He also said that the fox during Jesus' time could probably be a skunk or a rodent. Is the actual animal that they're thinking of, and he just said that, I think, and didn't prove it, or at least I didn't get excited about it and get convinced. But it would be very cool if it was a skunk. Okay, let's see, yes, probably my favorite question, the best for last. I'm a Pauline scholar. It means that in my PhD program, I study Paul almost exclusively. Wrote a lot of papers about him, published a few, and my book is about Paul. So whenever I see Paul, I kind of go nuts. So anyway, what is it about Paul that made him so special that the majority of his letters and writings make up the New Testament? Well, I don't know. I would say your name, but I don't know who asked the question. But the thing about Paul, there's several things about Paul. If you think about the history that we're going to study, that we've already talked about in the New Testament, Paul founded most of the churches in the New Testament. So there's just something about his character and something about the drive that he had and the the genuineness of his message, and people loved him. And so whenever he wrote letters, excuse me, whenever he wrote letters to these churches, they kept them and they treasured them. So they didn't consider Paul a criminal. You said that um, you know, Paul's a lifelong criminal. He couldn't stay out of jail. Whenever he was in jail, the churches helped him. So they really loved this guy. So that's why he makes up most of the New Testament. Even in the first century, well, if you consider 90, yeah, not between 90 and 150, Christians were writing letters to each other still. And in those letters, they praise Paul. Paul is already revered by people that didn't even know him. They're just getting the heritage of faith passed down, and Paul was a very important part of that. Another aspect of this, more specifically, is Paul's message of Jews and Gentiles uniting under the theology of Christ that Paul preached. He passionately believed that. And whenever you have this charismatic, passionate person with a radical message, successfully spreading it all over the Roman Empire, they remember him as a very important leader, even though Paul was kind of a weirdo sometimes. I got in trouble for saying that whenever I was in class. But even though Paul was a little weird, and he was a very dynamic person, and that's why his letters and writings make up most of the New Testament. So I just had to respond to some of these questions. They're very insightful, and I hope I see more. And please ask me questions if you need to know anything about any of this stuff.